Today I'm pleased to introduce Michael Dobbs. Michael is a reporter for The Washington Post and is presently responsible for the Fact Checker column, which I found a very helpful source last night as I watched the presidential debate, so you might want to check it out. He has spent much of his career as a foreign correspondent covering the collapse of communism and has served as the Post's bureau chief in Warsaw, Paris, and Moscow. Michael is here to talk about his latest book, 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the Brink of Nuclear War, an hour-by-hour study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In his work on this book, he used Google Earth for some historical research, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about that as well. Following the talk, we'll have a Q&A session. Remember our remote audience, and please use the microphone when you're asking a question. And now, please join me in welcoming Michael Dobbs.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be at Google. As Pat mentioned, I was converted to various Google products during the course of my research. I used Google Desktop to organize many of my records, Picasa for the photographs, not just the photographs, but I would go to the national various archives, photograph documents, and was able to use Picasa to organize all these photographs into sections and chapters, which was very helpful. And Google Earth, as I will explain, to actually locate important sites on Cuba where the Soviets stored their nuclear weapons and other military sites on Cuba. I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to write this book, what I think I've discovered, why it's pertinent for the elections, for the presidential election and the challenges that the next president is going to face, and also how I used Google Earth and other Google products in my research. I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis is really the best case study of, see if I can get these, of presidential decision-making at a time of supreme national crisis. It's very rare that we can get the kind of insights into how a president takes decisions in the way that we have all the documentation available in October 1962. President Kennedy formed a group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. You can see a photograph of it here. They met in the cabinet room of the White House, and the president had hidden or had microphones hidden behind the drapes. Actually, I need to get the. I need to stop this. Does anybody know how you stop this progressing through the slides? Hopefully this won't keep on turning over every few seconds. But this is the executive committee of the National Security Council called the ExComm, which was set up by the president to manage the crisis. And as I said, the meetings of the ExComm were tape recorded by Kennedy. So we have a complete contemporaneous record of everything of the president's key decisions and the debates in the White House over how to deal with the crisis, which is obviously something we're not likely to get with any president after Richard Nixon. But I was able to use these debates and the transcripts and describe not only what was happening in the White House, but what was happening in the rest of the world. And by telling this hour-by-hour narrative of the 13 days of the crisis, I juxtapose what is happening in the White House and what is happening in the rest of the world, what is happening in Cuba and what is happening in the Soviet Union. And when you do that, you find that often the two things don't mesh, that the debates in the White House actually bear very little relation with what is happening in the rest of the world. And in some cases, misinformation is coming into the White House, and there's a lot that the president doesn't know. You know, there's this famous Watergate question, what did the president know and when did he know it? And I really thought, studying the missile crisis, that the more pertinent question is what didn't the president know? Because the real dangers and risks that the world was facing in October 1962 really came from the ignorance of the president and the fact that he didn't completely control his own armed forces, rather than from what he knew. The missile crisis has been built up as a great case study in crisis management, and I think it really demonstrates the limits of crisis management. There are many of you probably born after 1962 are unfamiliar with what happened during the missile crisis. In fact, even the White House press secretary, Dana Perino, confused the missile crisis with the Bay of Pigs invasion, the abortive Bay of Pigs invasion the year before in 1961. So I should just say a few words about what was at stake during the missile crisis, which was really the ultimate national security crisis of the Cold War. Kennedy had been in power for 2 years. He was elected in 1960, obviously. Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959 as a result of the Cuban Revolution, and started nationalizing American properties in Cuba and greatly upsetting the US. And one way or the other, the successive US administrations, first Eisenhower and then Kennedy, were determined to put Castro in his place and, if possible, topple him from power. The Kennedys backed a mini invasion of Cuba by 1,300 Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Castro quickly rounded up all those Cubans, and so it was, the Bay of Pigs was a complete fiasco, but it led Khrushchev and Castro to believe that the Kennedys were out to replace Castro by fair means or foul. And so it was a result of that Khrushchev decided to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba. He never before sent nuclear weapons outside Soviet territory. So in the summer of 1962, they organized this massive armada across the Atlantic, sending various types of nuclear weapons, but particularly this missile. It was called the R-12 missile, which had a range of about 1,300 miles, could reach Washington, New York. It couldn't reach California, so you'd have been safe enough here. But it was the first time that the Soviets had deployed nuclear missiles outside the Soviet Union. It took the CIA about, the missiles began arriving in Cuba in mid-September, and it was not until mid-October that the CIA had positively identified the missile sites in Cuba. Then the president went on television on October the 16th, announced to the world that the Soviets had missiles in Cuba, that they had to withdraw them, and he imposed a naval quarantine or blockade around the island to force the Soviets to withdraw their missiles. And over the course of the next 13 days, the famous 13 days referred to by Bobby Kennedy in his book, the world was literally on the brink of nuclear war, not knowing whether or not Khrushchev would withdraw his missiles. So the question of what the president knew and what he didn't know. This is a slide from the CIA at the time showing what the Americans knew about Soviet military deployments on Cuba. And you can see those R-12 missiles in western Cuba at San Cristobal and also at central Cuba in a place called Sagua La Grande. The Soviets had also ringed the island with surface-to-air SAM missile sites, which were part of the air defenses. And they'd supplied the Cubans with Ilyushin-28 light bombers and MiG-21 fighters. But there was a lot that the president didn't know about what the Soviets had sent to Cuba. He was told by the CIA on October the 16th that there were between 6,000 and 8,000 Soviet technicians on Cuba. In fact, at that time, there were 42,000 heavily armed Soviet combat troops. In other words, 7 to 8 times the number of Soviet troops on Cuba that than the president had been told by the CIA. They were all dressed up in civilian clothes, but as you see, these guys hardly look like agricultural technicians. This particular photograph is of a Soviet motorized infantry regiment. The Soviets were all issued sort of pretty much identical checkered shirts, which led some of the Soviet participants in the operation to call it not Operation Anadir, but an Operation Checkered Shirt, because they were all meant to be in disguise, not a very effective disguise. The US had planned, in addition to the naval blockade, they had planned a massive air attack that would have taken out all the missile sites and would have been followed up within a week by a US invasion of Cuba, very similar to the D-Day landings in Normandy during the Second World War, along a 100-mile front with the participation of 100,000 US troops. Now, the US troops who were preparing to land in Cuba had no idea of the kind of opposition they would face from the Cubans and Soviets. First of all, they thought there were many fewer Soviet troops on Cuba than there in fact were, and as I'm going to explain, they never knew that the Soviets were equipped with tactical nuclear weapons that would have wiped out American invasion beachheads, such as this one at a place called Tarara Beach, east of Havana. This is a photograph of the Marine reconnaissance photograph of plan for the landings on Tarara Beach, which I was able to drop down as an overlay onto a Google Earth imagery. And back from the beach, you also see one of those SAM sites that I was talking about earlier. This is a larger photograph of the entire Havana region. So that Tarara is about 16 miles east of Havana. This is where the Marines were going to land had the president ordered an invasion of Cuba back in October 1962. Now, what the US didn't know at the time, they knew that the Soviets had deployed these medium-range missiles that could hit the United States in Cuba, but they didn't know anything. They knew very little about where the warheads for these missiles were stored. This guy here is a guy called Colonel Beloborodov, who was the head of the Soviet nuclear arsenal on Cuba. This photograph of him is at the helm of a ship called the Indogirka, which brought the nuclear warheads to Cuba during September 1962. One of the principal questions that the president kept asking of the CIA is, where are the warheads? Because the CIA had told him where the missile sites were, but the missile sites couldn't become operational until the warheads were brought from the storage centers and mated with the missiles themselves. So during the course of my research, I tried to resolve this mystery of where the Soviets stored their nuclear warheads on Cuba. And I talked to, I worked, as Pat said, as the Washington Post reporter in Moscow during the collapse of communism. So I was able to talk to a number of Soviet participants in Operation Anadyr, or Operation Checkered Shirt. And some of the people who actually handled the warheads said that the main nuclear storage site was a place called Bejucal, a little town south of Havana. So I went to Bejucal and started looking around. I couldn't see any place that looked like a nuclear warhead storage center. There's a photograph of downtown Bejucal. And it was not until I came back to the US and started looking in the archives, started looking at some of the raw intelligence film collected by the US Air Force and Navy, an Air Force plane like this one flying over Cuba during the missile crisis. This is a photograph of a Navy plane flying over Cuba during the missile crisis, that I began to resolve this mystery of where the warheads were located. Those planes would bring back hundreds and hundreds of cans of raw intelligence film, all of which have been declassified, and you can, they're actually stored in a gravel pit in Kansas, and you can, by going to the National Archives in Washington, you can actually order up all these cans and begin to try to look through the same evidence that US reconnaissance planes were collecting back in October 1962. So I began doing that in a very similar way to the way in which CIA analysts back in 1962 examined all this raw intelligence information. The finding aids for the finding aids for the films are very rudimentary. This shows the path of an American reconnaissance plane over Cuba and is associated with that can of film that I just showed you. But it doesn't tell you very much. I mean, it's a blank sheet of paper. In order to make anything out of it, I had to use it as an overlay onto a map of Cuba, and this is where Google Earth was very helpful to me. I took that overlay and put it on found out exactly how it should line up with a Google Earth map, and was able to figure out exactly where the American reconnaissance planes turned on their cameras, where they turned them off. And you see in this particular photograph that they turned on the camera here, turned it off here, then flew over to another part of, actually over the Bejucal area, turned on the camera again, and turned it off here. Actually, they overflew the Bejucal region and were photographing the these ammunition storage sites. So this is a photograph of the Bejucal region and the overlaid onto Google Earth, and shows the precise path of one of those US Navy planes taking photographs. It turns out that back in October 1962, the American reconnaissance plane actually took photographs of the Soviet nuclear warhead bunker at Bejucal. This is a photograph of the imagery of the Bejucal area south of Havana, and you can see that this nuclear storage bunker is just a little to the north of the town of Bejucal. Now, the key to identifying what the Soviets were doing with the nuclear warheads and how they were moving them around Cuba is from these nuclear warhead vans. Later on, the CIA linked these vans to the nuclear warheads. They're configured in a particular way. And at the front, you can see a sort of refrigeration device for keeping the warheads cool. So, pretty much if you find a photograph with these vans in them, you can be sure that that's a giveaway that the nuclear warheads are being stored either in the vans or close by. So by going through all this reconnaissance film at the National Archives, I was eventually able to find photographs of the nuclear warhead vans in the Behukal area. This is a overhead photograph of a group of 4 nuclear warhead vans plus another 2. At each missile site, there were 4 launching positions. The warheads would have been brought to the missile site, mated with the missiles, and at each missile site there were 4 launching positions plus 2 missiles in reserve, which is why you see this group of 4 vans plus 2, plus a crane for physically taking the warhead out of the van and mating it with the nuclear missile. So that configuration is, a pretty clear giveaway that this is a place where nuclear warheads are being stored. I was able to take that photograph and drop it onto the imagery, the Google Earth imagery. So here you see this is where the vans are, the warhead vans are parked at this side of the facility, and there's actually an underground bunker in this area. On this particular time, the warheads would have been stored in the underground bunker, but the vans would have been there ready to take the warheads to the missile sites. As in fact happened on the night of October 26th to 27th, the most critical couple of days of the crisis, Soviet commanders ordered some of the missiles to be armed with nuclear warheads, and the warheads were moved out of this missile site in Behukal and taken to the missile sites. This is something that the president knew nothing about at the time. This is a photograph taken from the nose of an American, of a U.S. Navy plane, of the warhead storage bunker at Behukal. And when the CIA analysts took a look at this photograph, they immediately they'd suspected that Behukal might be a site of a nuclear warhead storage center, but they, as soon as they saw the photographs, they dismissed it, because if you look here, you can see these vans here, but the security at the site is very, there's not much security. It's surrounded by a single fence. There's little security at the main entrance. There's not even a guard post here. The CIA couldn't imagine that this could be a nuclear warhead storage site. They'd photographed similar sites in the Soviet Union, and they were surrounded by 2 or 3 security fences. So as soon as they saw something with just surrounded by 1 security fence, they immediately dismissed it from consideration. But I was able to show, by the conjunction of the Soviets I'd talked to, plus the photographs of the warhead vans actually here, that this was in fact the Central Soviet Nuclear Warhead Storage Center in Cuba in October '62. The president was also completely unaware about a different class of weaponry. In addition to the missiles that could hit the United States, the Soviets also had tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba, weapons that were primarily intended not for use against U.S. territory, but for the defense of Cuba against a U.S. invasion. This is a very crude cruise missile. It's a stripped-down MiG-15 plane with an atomic bomb in the place where the pilot would normally be. But it was capable of delivering a Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb within a radius of 30 to 40 miles. The Soviets had 100 of these things on the island during the crisis. The purpose was, to wipe out the American beachheads and to also attack Guantanamo, the naval base at Guantanamo, and destroy the naval base at Guantanamo. Had President Kennedy listened to what some of his military advisors were telling him and proceeded with an invasion of Cuba in October 1962, the Soviets could well have used these tactical nuclear weapons to take out the American beachheads, to wipe out Guantanamo. And it would have been very difficult to have contained a nuclear exchange to just Cuba. I mean, it could well have escalated very rapidly into general nuclear war between the two superpowers. On the night of October 26th to the 27th, at the same time that the warheads were being distributed around the island, actually taken to the missile sites for mating with the missiles, these tactical nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, were being brought up to the vicinity, to the periphery of the Guantanamo naval base. And I was able to use declassified American intelligence documents in my interviews with Soviet participants in these events to establish the precise launch position from where the Soviet military was planning to attack Guantanamo with FKR cruise missiles. This is a photograph of the defenses of Guantanamo, the US Marine defense line around the naval base. And you can see them here looking out over the hills of eastern Cuba. What they didn't know, and what even the president didn't know, was that back in those hills there were tactical nuclear weapons that could have wiped out the naval base in a few minutes. Everything was coming to a head on October the 27th. Around the White House, they called October the 27th Black Saturday, because everything seemed to be going wrong and the president was losing control of events. He didn't know that the Soviets were, preparing for, in effect, for a nuclear war. The US was flying reconnaissance missions over Cuba, including a U-2 mission by piloted by this man, Major Rudy Anderson. And his mission was to take photographs in eastern Cuba around Guantanamo. And he actually flew over the Guantanamo region, and local Soviet commanders suspected him of taking photographs of their advanced positions next to Guantanamo. When they understood that he was heading back to Florida, heading out of Cuban airspace, they took a unilateral decision to shoot his plane down. This is a map of his last flight. He was shot down 10 minutes after flying over the Guantanamo naval base. And I think it's quite clear from the research that I've done that the reason that the Soviets shot him down was that they feared that he had discovered their advanced deployments toward the naval base. This is the group of Soviet anti-aircraft officers that shot Major Anderson down on Black Saturday. And this is the wreckage of Major Anderson's plane. Now, in addition to the fact that President Kennedy was really ignorant about many things that were happening in Cuba and what the Soviets precisely had on Cuba. He didn't fully control his own military. And I think the best example of this is the story of this man. His name is Chuck Mull Spy. He was a U-2 pilot who had the mission during October 1962 of flying to, he was stationed in Alaska, and he was a U-2 pilot. His job was to fly to the North Pole, scoop up samples from Soviet nuclear tests and fly back to Alaska. It was a very routine mission that had been going on for months. The Soviets were testing in the atmosphere as the United States was, and the US would send U-2s up in the direction of the North Pole to scoop up some of the debris from these nuclear tests and analyze it. And these perfectly routine missions continued throughout the missile crisis. Without anybody really paying very much attention. Now, as luck would have it, precisely at the time that all these other things are happening around Cuba, that the Soviets are moving up, are preparing to fire their nuclear missiles at the United States, that an American pilot is being shot down over the island, that the Soviets are bringing up tactical nuclear weapons to the periphery of the Guantanamo naval base. At precisely the same time, Mull Spy is off on his mission to the North Pole. And as chance would have it, on that precise day, he gets blinded by the aurora borealis. In those days, there's no GPS systems in the planes. You navigated by the stars. He couldn't, figure out where he was by the stars. And instead of coming back toward Alaska, he rolled out the wrong way and ended up over the eastern part of the Soviet Union on the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, I think the most critical day of the Cold War. This is a map that I found in the archives showing for the first time his precise flight route. He enters, this is all Washington time here, when he enters the Soviet territory around noon on October the 27th, almost at precisely the same time that his fellow U-2 pilot, Major Anderson, is getting shot down over Cuba. It's not until he starts hearing Russian music coming over his radio that he understands that he's made this sort of huge navigational error, is at least 1,000 miles where he should be, and is over Soviet territory. The Soviets send up MiG planes to try to shoot Mull Spy down from two different Air Force bases, one called Pevek and another called Anadyr. There's red lines of the lines of the Soviet MiGs being sent up to try to shoot this American U-2 down. Because Mull Spy is flying at 70,000 feet, the MiGs can only reach an altitude of 50,000 feet. They're unable to reach him, unable to shoot him down. At the same time, in Alaska, the Alaska air defenses have sent up a couple of F-102 interceptors armed with nuclear weapons to try to escort Mull Spy back across the Bering Straits. And this is really when we needed Sarah Palin to sort things out from Alaska and stop these Russians coming across. You had precisely the kind of confrontation across the Bering Straits that she's been talking about in some of the debates. Extraordinarily, Mull Spy, it's a long, I think, very exciting story about how Mull Spy gets back to Alaska. He runs out of fuel over the Bering Straits. It's a miracle that he lands back in Alaska. But this extraordinary story is happening at the same time as all the other events going on in Cuba, and the president knows nothing about it. From the time I worked out, the precise time of when Mull Spy entered Soviet territory, when he left, and when the president was told about it. And I figured out that Mull Spy was over Soviet territory for an hour and 15 minutes, and Kennedy was not informed about the incident until he'd already left Soviet territory. So, essentially we'd lost a plane, a U-2 military plane over the Soviet Union at this very critical time, and the president was completely unaware of it, even as the Soviet jets were trying to shoot that plane down. So, as I said at the beginning, the missile crisis has been taught at places like Harvard as a kind of case study in crisis management. And this was partly how it was spun by the Kennedy administration after the crisis. They sort of built Kennedy up as, the very cool, determined president who confronted his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, and forced Khrushchev to withdraw his missiles from Cuba, which he did the following day on October the 28th. But, what I really became convinced about as a result of my research and as a result of assembling this, hour by hour narrative of everything that was going on, was that the real risk of nuclear war in October 1962 did not come from this so-called eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between Khrushchev and Kennedy. It came from, all the sort of accidental, incidents that are impossible to predict when you put the machinery of war into motion. I mean, as soon as you sort of mobilize your armies, things start happening that it's impossible for even the best informed commanders to predict. And it's impossible for a president to completely, to know everything that is going on or even to control his own armed forces. In the end, I think that, both Kennedy and Khrushchev, they made a number of errors in the period leading up to the crisis. They were partly responsible for bringing this whole thing about, but in the end, they sort of had an instinctive understanding of the chaotic forces of history, and by Black Saturday, they both understood in their separate ways that they were losing control over events, which is why they both moved to diffuse the crisis on the day after Black Saturday. The events of Black Saturday frightened both men to the extent that they understood that a nuclear war would be disastrous for both countries, and in their different ways they pulled back. Khrushchev decided the following day to withdraw his missiles from Cuba. Kennedy made several concessions, including he promised the Soviets not to invade Cuba. He resisted the advice of his military commanders to go ahead with air attacks on the missile sites. He gave a private undertaking to Khrushchev through his brother and through the Soviet ambassador in Washington that he would withdraw U.S. missiles that had been deployed in Turkey. So, it wasn't exactly, the crisis ended with more of an understanding between the two leaders than, as has been depicted, a Soviet cave-in. Now, how does this relate to, the questions that one's going to face in choosing a next president? I think, the thing that what I was convinced about was the importance of personality in politics, particularly at this level, that had someone else been president in October 1962, without this instinctive understanding of the chaotic forces of history, then it would have been quite possible to imagine a nuclear war over Cuba. Well, I think I'll stop there, and if anybody's got any questions or wants to talk about any of this, I'd be happy to exchange ideas with you. But thank you very much for coming along. Yeah. Yeah, I think they want you to go to this mic to...
I was just hoping you could continue that thought of how the different personalities of the presidents might play out in this situation or going forward with the new presidency.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy actually in his memoirs called 13 Days, he said that of the 13 members of the ExComm, had half of them been president in October 1962. All these guys are obviously very bright people. They were very patriotic. They wanted to do the best for the country. But they could easily have approved a U.S. air attack against Cuba, and that would have probably been followed up by an invasion. Had that happened, we could well have got into a limited nuclear war on Cuba, which could quickly escalated into a general nuclear war. So, in Bobby Kennedy's view, at least, had any one of half of the members of the ExComm been president in 1962, the outcome would have been very different. Kennedy was, you probably know about Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force at the time. At that time, LeMay and the other generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they believed that Kennedy had completely gone down the wrong route by imposing a blockade around Cuba rather than attacking the missile sites. They thought this was very dangerous. Had he followed their advice, we might have ended up in nuclear war with the Soviets. Why did Kennedy resist the advice from the military? I think it's partly, this is his whole life experience that he brings to the presidency. Partly, he had served in the military during the Second World War. He had served out in the Pacific in this famous PT boat. And so he had experienced the military from the bottom up. And he understood that a commander-in-chief doesn't just issue orders and everybody carries out those orders. One of his favorite sayings was, the military always screws up. And he got that from personal experience in the military. When he was told that this U-2 pilot had gone missing over the Soviet Union, his reaction was, there's always some son of a bitch that doesn't get the word. So he was skeptical about, that was just in his makeup, that he was skeptical about what he was being told by the military commanders. Then there was also the experience that he had had as president. The year before, he had followed the advice of the military and the CIA and had supported this abortive invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And he deeply regretted, following the, doing what they suggested at the Bay of Pigs. So the following year, in 1962, that made him much more skeptical. But he had learned on the job. I think, Bill Clinton said the other day about Obama that, nobody, obviously, Obama has got sort of limited military experience, but Clinton said, nobody is prepared to become, the only preparation for being president is actually, experience as president. And I think Kennedy showed that in 1962. Had the missile crisis happened in 1961, the outcome might have been very different. Yeah, were you?
Oh,
yeah.
So what about the other side? I never hear anything about sort of the Soviet side of these. Like, what's What do you think about them in terms of what were their motivations? How close were, how far were they willing to play this game? And
How far they were? What?
How far were they willing to go? What were the attitudes of that administration? Was that a bunch of militarists? Sort of kind of portray this way that this was sort of the evil force that we had to sort of diplomatically, wrangle around in order to avoid this crisis. So, what's the reality of that?
Right.
That
well,
aspect.
Khrushchev, at the time, undoubtedly, the U.S. had great military superiority over the Soviet Union. We had, about 10 times as many nuclear weapons as they had. They only had on Soviet territory about 30 or 40 nuclear weapons that could reach the United States, and they weren't very accurate. So one of the, what were Khrushchev's motivations in sending these missiles to Cuba? One of them was to defend Cuba, to defend Castro, because he was convinced that and he had some evidence for it, that the U.S. was out to topple Castro. But another motivation was that he wanted to sort of even up this nuclear imbalance, as he saw it, by deploying all these intermediate range or medium range missiles in Cuba. He would add to the number of his missiles that could reach the United States. But he was constantly, being in a weaker position, he wanted to constantly sort of push the United States to the brink. He was a risk taker, but he wasn't a risk taker to the extent that he wanted to push the world into nuclear war. He just wanted to scare the Americans, to give them a taste of their own medicine, rather than, and as soon as it became clear to him that this could all end very badly, and it might actually end in a nuclear war, his attitude changed 180 degrees. He said we have records of some of the Politburo meetings in Russia, and he said, the idea was not at all to go to a nuclear war. He was horrified by the idea that it might end in a nuclear war. He understood that he was sort of playing with fire. He had met Kennedy the year before at this meeting in Vienna in 1961. And he had come away with with the impression of Kennedy, as he said, of being too intellectual and too weak. And he thought he could, push Kennedy around and bully him. And, that was part of what he was doing in October 1962. He was trying to, push Kennedy to the limit, and he thought he would be able to send these missiles to Cuba, activate them, all in secret, and by the time that the Americans found out about it, it would be too late because the missiles would be ready to be fired at the United States. But in fact, as we now know, we discovered the missiles in the course of preparation, which ruined Khrushchev's plans. There's also a third actor, of course, and that is Castro. And of the three men, I think it's Fidel Castro who was the only one among them who was really prepared to contemplate a nuclear war on his territory. And from the US point of view, Khrushchev was pretty rational, but Castro, he approved the use of nuclear weapons on Cuban territory to defeat an American invasion of Cuba. I mean, he was the one person who was willing to go willing to contemplate a nuclear war. Anybody else?
Okay. Correct me if I have my facts wrong. I was wondering about it seems like an asymmetry here. The cause of the crisis was that Russia or the Soviet Union brought nuclear missiles within 90 miles of the United States. But didn't the U.S. have nuclear missile bases in Turkey, which is a comparable distance from the Soviet Union? Mm-hmm. And that was just the status quo.
Right. Yeah, we had actually, they're deployed missiles called Jupiters, which were very similar to these missiles that the Soviets had deployed in Cuba. U.S. had stationed them in both Turkey and Italy during the course of 1962. And is one of Khrushchev's grievances against the United States that the U.S. had put all these medium-range missiles in Turkey. He had his vacation retreat was on the other side of the Black Sea in in Sochi, and he would sort of look out across the Black Sea and imagine these American missiles aimed at his vacation retreat. And so another part of his motivation, I think, was trying to get back at the Americans, to give the Americans a taste of their own medicine. In fact, Putin's motivations in his recent actions against Georgia and other places, I think, are very similar to Khrushchev's motivations back in October 1962, this sense of grievance against the United States getting its way around the world. Now, the Jupiter missiles did in fact become part of the final understanding resolving the crisis, because Khrushchev sent a letter again on Black Saturday to Kennedy offering an exchange. He said, I'll pull my missiles out of Cuba if you take your missiles out of Turkey. And everybody told Kennedy that he shouldn't accept that exchange, that it would ruin NATO, it would harm US relations with Turkey. And at one point, he was really the only guy in the room who was prepared to contemplate an exchange. And it's, I think, part of the myth of the missile crisis that there wasn't an exchange, that Kennedy didn't give in to Khrushchev. But in fact, he sent Bobby to the Soviet embassy in Washington late that same night, on the night of Black Saturday, saying, okay, you have to pull your missiles out of Cuba, but in return, we will pull our missiles out of Turkey over the course of the next few weeks. But we ask that that part of the deal not be made public. So that was a kind of private understanding, but it was still part of the final deal. But it didn't become public until many, many years later. So at the time, the Kennedy crowd were able to say, that they hadn't given very much to Khrushchev, but they had given him, explicit guarantee that they wouldn't invade Cuba, and they had also given him this private understanding that they would remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey.
Thanks.
Thank you.
In reading 13 Days, it sounds like after they got the message from Khrushchev, they worried that that he might not be in control of events on the other side. Was there any truth to that?
Right, you
That
mean
he lost
Bobby
control?
Kennedy's memoirs you're talking about?
Right, yeah. That he lost control of
Right.
the decision-making process?
Yeah, there was a lot of kind of bogus Kremlinology in the XCOM after they received the second message, and they sort of thought that Khrushchev might have lost control, might have even been overthrown by some of the other more hardline members of the Politburo. It was, I think, it was completely untrue. Khrushchev was completely in control of events inside the Soviet Union. Nobody in the Politburo was challenging him at this time. In fact, they thought this was his problem, that it had been his idea to send missiles to Cuba, and that it was up to him to resolve the question. And there's some differences in the style of the various letters that were coming from Khrushchev, but it's mainly explainable by Khrushchev's changing moods and the fact that some of the earlier letters were kind of polished up by the bureaucrats, whereas the later letter was more sort of Khrushchev, expressing himself emotionally, and the bureaucrats not having time to, dress it up in bureaucratic language. But no, I think the Americans got it wrong, that Khrushchev was completely in control.
I was a bit surprised to learn just a few months ago that apparently during the Cold War, the use of tactical nuclear weapons was actually something that a theater commander could authorize for U.S. forces, which is a pretty scary prospect. I also heard an anecdote that on the Russian side during the missile crisis, there was actually an order to use for a submarine to attack with a nuclear-tipped torpedo that was refused by the captain of the submarine. Could you comment on the importance of this sort of lower-level decision-making to use the tactical weapons?
Yeah, there was sort of been some confusion on the Soviet side of who, in fact, had the authority to use these weapons. And under Soviet doctrine, normally the commanders in the field would have the authority to use them. In fact, This is one of the things that alarmed Khrushchev during the course of the crisis, and he withdrew that authority. Now, there are two different things. There's the question of who has the authority to use the weapons and who has physical control over the weapons, because in practice, in those days, there were no locks or codes preventing the use of the weapons, and communications between Cuba and the Soviet Union were very bad. So it's quite possible to conceive of circumstances in which the local Soviet commanders would have used tactical nuclear weapons to defend themselves on their own authority, just as they had shot down Major Anderson's plane on their own authority. And then you mentioned the submarines. Yeah, this is another thing that Kennedy didn't know at the time, that the Soviets he knew that the Soviets had submarines operating in the Caribbean. What he didn't know was that these submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes, and conditions down below in the submarines were terrible. The Soviet submariners were under great stress. At one point, the U.S. Navy starts trying to get the submarines to surface using depth charges, and the Soviet sailors are trapped in this sort of tin can, hearing these explosions around them, and all they have to defend themselves is, a nuclear torpedo. And they don't know if nuclear war has, broken out above their heads because they have no communications in Moscow. On the American side, I always thought that I thought that the president retained command authority over tactical nuclear weapons as well as strategic nuclear weapons. I'm not sure which incident you're referring to, but certainly this is the unauthorized use of nuclear weapons was one of the things that concerned Kennedy during the crisis. And for example, he was worried about the use of these, the Jupiters in Turkey might be fired without his permission. And he tried, during the crisis itself, to strengthen his command authority over the Jupiters in Turkey. Anybody else?
I'd just like to know about the mashups with Google Earth that you were showing and all that.
Yeah.
Is that available online anywhere publicly? Have you posted that?
Yeah, I've posted some of it. Well, I've posted some of the. I plotted some of these things on Google Maps, and there's a website operated by a group called the National Security Archive in Washington. So if you do a search for National Security Archive and Cuban Missile Crisis and put my name in it, you'll find some of the Google Maps that I put up there. And I actually have links to, some of this Google Earth material I put into KMZ files. And I have links to some of those KMZ files on those postings for the National Security Archive. So you should be able to find them.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, probably about 15 years ago, give or take a couple, I saw a documentary on PBS about the Cuban Missile Crisis with the new information that was available after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that and if you know what the title was. And the PBS documentary. Yeah. If you're familiar with it, if you happen to know the title of it, because I'd really like to hunt it down and watch it again. And the second part is, during that, I remember somebody asserting that had we actually had full intelligence on Cuba and that we knew that they had nukes there already, that we would have invaded Cuba. And I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly or not.
Yeah, I don't know the name of the PBS documentary that you are referring to, but I'm sure you can find it at their site. But as for the second part of your question, I think this is a former CIA analyst or State Department intelligence guy called Ray Gartoff said, that had we known, or had the president known, that the U.S. had all these, the Soviets had all these tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba, it might have complicated the resolution of the crisis because, in addition to negotiating the withdrawal of the strategic weapons, they would have also had to, the tactical weapons would have become a subject for negotiation. So, it could actually have complicated things. Also, had the CIA identified positively this site at Behukal as the place where the Soviets were storing their nuclear warheads, then the president might well have ordered a paratroop drop on Behukal in an attempt to seize the warheads. And this was part of the plan, that if they ever discovered where the warheads were, they might organize an operation to seize the warheads. And that could have caused a complication. So, it's true that on the one hand, the president's ignorance, all these things the president didn't know, constitute a great danger. But on the other hand, perhaps it was just as well he didn't know certain things, because he would have been, scared out of his wits. So I think we've probably exhausted the questions, but thank you very much for giving up your lunch hour and coming to listen to me. Thank you.